For decades, Simon Cowell was the face of brutal honesty in television. He was the man who could destroy dreams with a single comment, who built his empire on sharp judgment and emotional distance. But something shifted. Not overnight, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The world began to notice a different man, softer, more thoughtful, occasionally emotional in moments that seemed out of character. And naturally, the internet had a theory. A son in crisis, a hidden family tragedy, a diagnosis no one was supposed to know about. But the real story is far more interesting than any rumor. It's about what actually transforms a person, and why the truth is always more compelling than the narratives we create in the absence of it. In 2023 and 2024, social media exploded with unverified claims about Simon Cowell's family. Videos with dramatic thumbnails flooded platforms. Posts spread claiming that Eric Cowell, Simon's young son, was facing a serious, undisclosed illness. The narratives were carefully constructed, emotional, relatable, pulling at the heartstrings of millions. They featured edited clips of Simon looking serious or withdrawn, paired with sad music and ominous titles. The algorithm amplified them. The rumors felt real because they were presented with such conviction. But when you actually examined the evidence, something critical emerged. There were no confirmed medical reports, no verified statements from the family, no credible sources supporting the claim. What there was, instead, was a void, a gap where people expected explanation. And in that gap, the internet created a story. And like most viral narratives, it was simpler, more dramatic, and more emotionally satisfying than whatever truth lay beneath it. The reality of Eric Cowell's life, according to credible accounts from those close to the family, tells a completely different story. He has been seen in family moments looking active, healthy, and happy. He lives a relatively normal childhood. He is not battling a rare disease. The diagnosis that captured the internet's attention was never actually about him at all. It was about projection, about assuming the worst when confronted with visible change in a public figure. It was about mistaking the cause for the effect. If Eric wasn't sick, then why did Simon Cowell change? Why did the man who was famous for his cold demeanor begin showing genuine emotion? Why did he step back from the relentless work schedule that had defined him for decades? Why did his entire energy shift in a way that even casual viewers could detect? The answer requires understanding Simon Cowell not as a brand, but as a person who spent years building something extraordinary while sacrificing nearly everything else in the process. Before fatherhood, Simon lived inside his work. He was a man consumed by the details of his empire, the ratings, the performances, the endless cycle of production. There were periods where he would work until 4 a.m., not because anyone demanded it, but because he felt compelled to. He didn't sleep much. He didn't rest. He didn't step away. His identity was so completely fused with his professional success that it was impossible to separate the man from the brand. This lifestyle, while it created unprecedented success, came at a cost. Simon later admitted something that surprised people who only knew his public persona. Behind the fame, behind the sharp comments, behind the reputation for being untouchable, there was a man struggling quietly. Not in a dramatic way that makes headlines, but in a slow, grinding way that happens when your entire existence revolves around achievement and external validation. He described feeling low, not clinically depressed in the traditional sense, but worn down, heavy, the way someone feels when they've been running too hard for too long without ever stopping to question why. When Eric was born, something shifted in Simon Cowell that he himself did not anticipate. He has spoken openly about how fatherhood hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just the addition of a new role. It was a complete rewiring of his priorities. Suddenly, he had another person who depended on him in a way that didn't involve ratings or business strategy. He had a son who simply wanted his father's presence. This forced a confrontation with a question he had never really answered. What was he doing all this for? If the point of building an empire was security, he had achieved that many times over. If it was validation, he received that constantly. But none of that could give him back time with his son. None of it could ensure he wouldn't miss the moments that would later become the most important memories. And for a man who had structured his entire life around control and winning, this realization was unsettling. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, accumulating, building slowly until it became impossible to ignore. Simon began, intentionally, to pull back from the lifestyle that had consumed him. He stopped staying awake until 4 a.m. reviewing performance metrics. He started taking time off. He became present, genuinely present, in a way that someone constantly chasing the next achievement never can be. And here's what most people miss. This wasn't weakness. This was one of the strongest decisions he could make. But there was another catalyst in Simon's transformation that intersected with fatherhood in a profound way. When you become a parent, especially a father, and especially when you love that child deeply, you develop a new kind of vulnerability. You understand, in a way you never did before, what loss could feel like. You know the stakes of caring about someone more than you care about yourself. And once you feel that, you cannot unsee it. This vulnerability became a mirror. Suddenly, when contestants took the stage on Britain's Got Talent or The X Factor, Simon didn't see just performers anymore. He saw someone's child, someone's hope, someone's everything. And when a young performer came forward with a story about struggle, illness, hardship, a dream that seemed impossible, Simon felt it differently than he would have before fatherhood. One moment that illustrated this shift involved a young dancer named Julia Carlisle. She had been diagnosed with scoliosis, a serious spinal condition that threatened her ability to continue dancing. For a dancer, this isn't just a medical challenge. It's a threat to the entire future they've been building toward. When Julia performed despite this condition, something in the audience shifted. And it shifted most dramatically for Simon. What happened next became one of the clearest examples of how fundamentally Simon had changed. Rather than offering sympathetic words and moving on, Simon took action. Reports indicated that he personally funded Julia's life-changing surgery, contributing a substantial amount to ensure she had access to the treatment she needed. This wasn't a publicity move. It was a private decision made by a man who understood, through the lens of fatherhood, what it meant to fear for someone you care about. But here's where the narrative got twisted. The internet saw Simon's emotional reaction. They saw his obvious care for Julia and other vulnerable performers. They saw a man who was clearly affected, clearly moved, clearly changed from the persona they had known for years. And instead of asking the right questions, they created a simpler story. If Simon was emotional about someone else's child's crisis, maybe it was because his own child was in crisis. Maybe Eric was sick. Maybe that was the explanation for everything. This is how rumors are born. Not from malice, necessarily, but from the human tendency to connect dots that don't actually connect. From the assumption that changed behavior must be caused by changed circumstances in the person's immediate life. From the storytelling instinct that makes us complete incomplete pictures with the narratives we find most emotionally satisfying. The truth, however, was more complex and ultimately more interesting. Simon's emotional shift wasn't about a hidden family tragedy. It was about awakening. It was about a man who had spent decades at a distance from his own feelings suddenly having those feelings forced upon him by the simple act of loving another person completely. It was about understanding, for the first time, what vulnerability actually meant. And once that door opens, it doesn't close. There's another piece of this story that often gets overlooked. Around the same time that Simon was becoming a father and deepening his emotional awareness, his body forced a conversation he couldn't ignore. He suffered a back injury that required treatment and recovery. For a man who had spent years pushing past pain, ignoring exhaustion, and treating his body as just another tool to be optimized for productivity, this injury became a wake-up call. Instead of rushing back into the same patterns once he healed, Simon made a different choice. He adjusted his lifestyle. He listened to what his body was telling him. He accepted limitations he would have previously fought against. This might sound simple, but for someone who had built an identity around pushing past limits and refusing to acknowledge constraint, it was revolutionary. The injury and recovery process gave Simon something unexpected: permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to prioritize health over achievement. Permission to admit that the 4 a.m. work sessions that had defined his professional life were no longer sustainable or desirable. The physical pain forced a reckoning that his mind might have never allowed on its own. For years, Simon Cowell's brand was built on a specific image. The sharp judge. The man who said no when others said yes. The person who could crush dreams in seconds without flinching. This image sold. It created compelling television. It made Simon famous and powerful in ways that gentleness never could. The early 2000s television landscape rewarded that kind of ruthlessness. But something fundamental changed in both Simon and in the culture around him. The world's hunger for cruelty disguised as honesty diminished. And more importantly, Simon himself no longer wanted to traffic in that currency. He had seen too much. He had felt too much. He understood, through his own experience and through his role as a father, that behind every person on that stage was an entire interior life. Dreams, fears, hopes, families waiting at home. The shift was visible if you knew where to look. In the past, Simon would interrupt performances mid-song if he lost interest. He wanted results, perfection, marketability. Now, he listens longer. He leans forward. He asks genuine questions. There are moments where you can actually see his expression change before he speaks, as though he is processing something deeper than just the performance itself. Even when he says no, and he still does, it sounds different. Less like a shutdown, more like guidance. More like someone who understands that rejection can be an act of kindness if delivered with genuine care rather than performative cruelty. So what does the future look like for Simon Cowell now that this transformation is firmly established? It looks quieter, not small, but intentional. He is still involved in television, still shaping shows, still influential in the industry. But it no longer feels like he is chasing something. It feels like he is choosing what matters. He has openly admitted that his priorities have shifted fundamentally. He no longer wants to be the man who is constantly working, constantly chasing the next big thing. He wants to be present, more grounded, more aware of what actually matters. And you can see this reflected in small details. The way he talks about his son, the way he describes their routines together, the way he smiles when discussing things that have nothing to do with television. There is also a quiet question sitting in the background of this entire story. As Eric grows up in the world of entertainment, surrounded by it, understanding it in a way most children never will, what will his future look like? Some people speculate that he might follow in his father's footsteps. But here's the twist. Simon doesn't seem obsessed with that outcome. The old Simon would have planned it, controlled it, designed the future like a business strategy. The new Simon seems content letting Eric simply be a kid. He seems willing to let life unfold without turning everything into a project. And that might be the biggest transformation of all. What people have misunderstood from the beginning is what Simon was actually saying goodbye to. It wasn't a goodbye to television or to his career. It was a goodbye to a version of himself. A goodbye to the man who lived in the office until 4 a.m. A goodbye to the constant pressure and the need to prove something. A goodbye to the belief that success measured in ratings and fame was the ultimate goal worth sacrificing everything for. This was a goodbye forced by tragedy. It was a goodbye chosen out of awareness. It was the decision of a man who finally understood that the version of himself he had been performing for decades was costing him more than he was willing to pay anymore. And in walking away from that version, he discovered something he had been missing all along: the capacity to feel, to connect, to be moved by someone else's struggle without immediately trying to solve it or minimize it. The internet got the story wrong, but it was wrong in an interesting way. It assumed that dramatic change must come from loss, that transformation requires tragedy, that a public figure can only show emotion if something devastating has happened. But the truth about Simon Cowell is actually more hopeful than that. His transformation didn't come from his son being sick. It came from his son being born. It came from becoming a father and understanding, for the first time, what it means to love someone more than you love success. It came from watching vulnerable people on a stage and recognizing them through the lens of that fatherly love. It came from his body forcing him to stop and his mind finally being ready to listen. This is a story about awakening, not about loss. It's about a man who chose to step away from the darkness of endless ambition to stand in his son's light. It's about someone famous for judging others finally learning how to show up for the one person who matters most. And it's a reminder that the most profound transformations in life don't always come from disaster. Sometimes they come from love. Sometimes they come from finally asking yourself what you're doing all this for, and being honest enough to accept that